What is good, my people? How are you? Good. My name is Nicholas. I'm one of the pastors here at Fountain Springs. Quick welcome to our friends at East. If you're joining us, watching this downtown, maybe you're joining us online, we're just so glad that you're with us today. We are in the second week of a seven-part series this summer on the 7 deadly sins. These are those sins that, throughout history and in pop culture maybe have taken on almost like this mythic sort of quality. And these 7 sins in a way represent like a reduction of all other sins, all of the sins that we can commit. And many of us have committed a whole slew of them, I suppose, but they can be reduced to these 7 sins. They have their roots in these initial 7 sins. And for each of the 7 sins, there is a positive opposite. There are the 7 virtues, 7 sins and 7 virtues. The first week, Pastor Chris came out on a moped, honked his horn at you, and talked about the sin of envy. And the positive opposite of envy is the practice of kindness. And today, I have the great pleasure of talking to you about greed. And the positive opposite of greed is generosity. But whenever we talk about generosity or living a generous life, it's normal to start to feel just a little bit anxious or awkward, maybe even uncomfortable, because a conversation about generosity almost always becomes a conversation about money, which is entirely my intention today, just to be clear. But questions about how we spend our money they're kind of tough. So what I'd like to do here at the beginning is I want to ask you to engage in a bit of a mental exercise with me. Does that sound okay? Nod your head, this means yes? Good. The room that we are standing in is about 8,500, maybe 9,000 square feet. This auditorium is about 9,000 square feet. If you're watching at home, I read this last week that the average American living room is 330 square feet. I honestly don't know if that's a lot, or if that's a big living room or a small one. I have no idea. Anyway, so your room is a little bit smaller, but we're in a room of about 9,000 square feet. And the average male African elephant stands 13 feet tall. It is 20 to 30 feet long, and it weighs somewhere between 16 and 20,000 pounds. I want you to imagine, so right now, there's a pretty chill vibe in the room, right? Everyone's pretty relaxed. Y'all look like you're having a reasonably good time, given the circumstances. And I think we're all doing all right. But I want you to imagine how the vibe in the room would begin to change if through one of these back doors into the center of the room walked a 13-foot tall, possibly 30-foot long, 20,000-pound African male elephant standing right here in the center of the room. At the very least, you would start to feel that reptilian brain begin to activate there at the top of your spine, that fight, flight, or freeze mechanism would start to engage a little bit. You'd start to become a little bit more aware of your surroundings, whether we admit it or not. And if the elephant began to show a little bit of aggression. Now, elephants generally are very mild-tempered animals. They don't like to really mess with people, but they have been known to sort of show aggression or violent responses when they feel trapped or threatened. And if that elephant in the middle of the room here suddenly began to show some aggression, and let's say it kind of raised up on its back haunches and started stomping around on the ground, and I do this with my kids sometimes, it's right? Kind of that's a decent elephant, isn't it? Thank you. I got a lot of practice. But it sort of, waves its trunk up in the air. And we all clearly get the idea that this elephant appears to be feeling some sort of emotion in that moment. Not only would these mechanisms engage, but you would begin thinking about the safety of yourself and the safety of the people in this room that you care the most about. And that would be a natural response. We wouldn't be able to pretend that the elephant isn't in the room and just continue on with our day. But if you were in the room today and you had spent some time around elephants in the past, let's say maybe you had trained elephants, or you had worked in an animal sanctuary where you had fed elephants, and you had been around them day in and day out for a considerable amount of time, you might notice or interpret the movements of the elephant in a way different than the rest of us do. And so where many of us see the potential for terror and destruction, you might actually just see a beautiful animal who is trying to be playful or something like that, right? You might see wonder where we see fear. Now, the reason this metaphor of the elephant in the room works so well is because first, we all sort of know what the metaphor means. That there's this uncomfortable topic that nobody wants to talk about. But the second reason it works really well is because the evidence that's revealed is sort of undeniable, right? If there is an elephant in the room, I will quickly know what I'm going to do in response to it. I could say I'm going to behave a certain way or I wouldn't be afraid, but eventually, like whatever's on the inside would be revealed quite quickly. High pressure moments sort of reveal the truth about who we are. And when we talk about elephants, those of us with little firsthand experience, it's very normal for us to maybe exhibit a little bit of fear. In the same way that when we talk about generosity, those of us who maybe have little firsthand experience might feel like this is a conversation that's sort of like ready to stomp or pounce on us at any moment. But for those of us who have like maybe spent some time living generous lifestyles, who have experienced like the beauty and the transformation and the freedom that comes with living a generous life, well, we might just see beauty where you see the potential for fear. So I want to acknowledge that here at the beginning and recognize that this metaphor forces us to sort of come to terms with what we know to be true. We can talk all that we want in coffee shops or on social media about what we would do to be more generous in life, but you still know what you do with the resources that you have available. You know whether or not you're a generous person, regardless of this mental exercise. You know what you spend your resources on. And if I want to know what you spend your resources on, all I have to do is look at your calendar and your bank account. Time and money. Where do you spend your time and where do you spend your money? It's the most objective evidence I could use to truly determine what you believe is meaningful or valuable. Time and money. Where do you spend your time? Where do you spend your money? And it's worth at least mentioning before we go further that every major religion I'm aware of supports this idea of tithing or giving or almsgiving, offerings as a central component for what it looks like to live a life of meaning and purpose. Every religion in the world seems to agree that our happiness or our joy is hardwired to our ability to live lives that give to others. And if we took a poll this morning, my guess is, if we took a poll in this room this morning, every one of you would agree with me. Almost everybody would say, I believe it's important to live a life of generosity. I believe we should be using even our financial resources to do things to help those around us in need. And yet, I think we're all aware that there is a wide gap between the desire to bless others and the practice of blessing others. So today I want to talk to you about how we live lives that bless others, even with our finances. And just to sort of show you the end from the beginning, I want to talk to you today in three parts. I want to talk about gratitude, I want to talk about generosity, and I want to talk about living a life of faithfulness. So part one, gratitude. You've got 5 seconds. Turn to someone near you and tell them how you would define gratitude. Go. Time's up. Okay. My guess is you said something like this: gratitude is being thankful for what you have. Did the word thankful come up in some of your definitions? It's being thankful, something like being thankful for what you have. But it requires almost a follow-up question, which is, okay then, so what exactly do we have? I'm going to share some information with you that you've probably seen something similar to in the past, but I think it's a good refresher for us as we go forward. So take a look at this. 1.5 billion people in the world live on $1.25 or less a day. 2/3 of the world's population lives on less than the price of a cup of coffee a day. Last weekend, Americans spent $1 billion on fireworks. About half of that was in Rapid Valley because I watched the valley explode. Every 3 seconds, a child dies of malnutrition. Children are almost always disproportionately affected by a lack of resources. In the United States, 1 in 165 children will die before they reach the age of 5. But in the world, 1 in 6 children will die before the age of 5, and this is almost always by preventable illnesses. The poor in the world spend 80% of their income on food. Americans spend 10% of their income on food. If you make $10,000 a year, you are in the wealthiest 16% of the world. If you own a car or a computer, you are in the wealthiest 7% of the world. And if you have a college education, you are in the top 1% of the world. Now, we could go on, but I suspect you get the point here. You've seen things like this before, no doubt. How many people in the world would climb mountains, would swim oceans, would cross deserts to have even a fraction of what we have? Now, none of this is our fault. And I feel like it's important to draw that distinction, especially given like cultural conversations over the last 4 or 5 years. You can't help the world that you are born into. But here is what I at least find ironic. Look inward at your own life, or look outward and observe the lives of the people around you. And ask yourself if you get the sense that we act like we are some of the most blessed people, not only on the planet today, but in all of human history. Or has our privilege made us more selfish? And if that is the case, why do you suppose that is? We have phones that talk to us now. Do you understand how unbelievable that is? We have so much available, and yet we seem more selfish. Shouldn't more stuff generate more happiness? We certainly live as if we believe a principle like that, but as we accumulate more things, presumably when we purchase them, we're purchasing them because we believe they have a benefit to give to our lives. Shouldn't more stuff mean more benefits, which means happier people? In my observation, though, we never seem to have enough time in our calendar, and we never seem to have enough money in our bank accounts. Time and money. We are all so busy, and we are all so broke. Our lives are runaway trains. Many of us are barely coping. If we're honest, we're barely coping as it is. We live paycheck to paycheck. We are mentally exhausted, emotionally exhausted. We're all in need of some alone time. We are all in need of some time just for ourselves to get away and recharge. We are all in need of extended vacations. I'm not saying that none of this is true, any of the time, but what would it be like if we were sort of forced to live like the 7 billion people on the planet who have none of the things that we take for granted? Folks, I think we have a gratitude deficiency. I think we are malnourished in terms of our gratitude. It's easy to focus on what we don't have. It's easy to focus on what we wish we had, the job that we used to have, the relationship that if we only had. We all think we need more money. We have a gratitude deficiency, and greed is the sworn enemy of gratitude. But when we are grateful, we are declaring that we believe God is in control and that we believe that God will provide whatever it is. When we are grateful, whatever it is that we have right now is enough. I actually think that many of us almost have too much in life to be grateful. We've lost our capacity for gratitude because we just have so much, right? We have so much blessing in our lives that we don't know what it's like to live without things that we want. We've lost our capacity for gratitude. Let me try to demonstrate what I mean by that. Back in 2009, I think it was, I was shoveling some snow and I was listening to a podcast. And I heard the story of a guy named Alexander Gamay, who was a Norwegian explorer and adventurer. And he had just returned from an unassisted trip to the South Pole and back on skis. 1,400 miles by himself, freezing cold temperatures. And he was talking about it, this podcast host was translating, was talking about his plan. He had gone to the South Pole, and on the way there, he carried a number of supplies with him. In just a second, I'm going to show you a video that's going to make this important. But he carried a number of supplies with him, and then along the way, he would bury like these caches or these bags of supplies so he wouldn't have to carry them with him the whole way. Again, it's 1,400 miles. But he buried them under the snow and put a flag in the ground. Well, on the 86th day, he's coming back. 86th of a 90-day trek. He's coming back and he is absolutely exhausted and he is hungry. He has hardly any food to eat. He's been rationing his food for several days, so he's very, very hungry. And he's coming up on his second to last cache. And he says he's almost positive that he didn't put food in there because it would have been one of the first or second caches. He just thought logically he wouldn't do it. But he didn't keep a record of what was in each one because he wanted to motivate himself to keep going, he said. So this is a video of him, hungry, tired, exhausted, mentally fatigued, coming up on the second to last cache and finding what's inside. Watch this with me.
Se her, ja. Nå jeg jævla spent på om tenk om jeg hadde lagt igjen noe godteri. Det hadde vært toppers. Drikker enda mer vaselin. Det har jeg for så vidt ikke bruk for. Sinksalve. Så faller jeg la igjen. Det er ganske mye her, altså. Det var tydeligvis bra. Ja! Ja! Er det virkelig? Hæ? La jeg igjen det? Ja! Det er dobbel pose cheese-noodles. Ja! Ja! Jeg er så sulten. Så må jeg klart på noe ekstra trekt av... Hva er det jeg har tenkt da? Har jeg drevet lagt inn dette her? Jeg har sikkert tenkt jeg har prøvd å spart vekt da. Det er jo ikke mulig. Hæ?
Isn't that one of the most enjoyable videos you've ever seen? When is the last time you screamed like that? For no one to hear. Just out of like deep, sheer gratitude. Now it's possible that Gamay is screaming because he just really loves cheese doodles. But I think what we're witnessing here is something else. I think what we're witnessing is a condition of his heart. After 86 days, pushing himself to the limits and accomplishing this great task, he finds this unexpected blessing. Gratitude requires perspective. And on day 86, Alexander Gamay found it. But he had to lose every sense of normalcy to recognize it. When is the last time you truly went without something? To leave space for perspective. In Luke chapter 18, Jesus is asked by this rich young landowner what he must do to experience eternal life. everlasting life, but also like fullness of life. When Jesus heard this, he said to him, "You still lack one thing. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." In other words, fullness of life, meaning and purpose and contentment is in direct correlation to the degree to which you give what you have away. If you want to know how to live a life of fullness, find ways to give what you have away. This is another great reversal in the teachings of Jesus. The path to generosity is not found when you've accumulated enough stuff, because when will you ever have enough? I've often heard people say, when I get, this bill paid off, or when I get my finances in order, or when I have a better job, or when I get a raise, then I will learn to be generous. Do you know how often that's the case? Never. Never. When would you ever have enough to be generous? Those who are driven by desire will always desire more. But those who are driven by generosity will always find more to give away. About 20 years ago, my life was changed when I read a book called In the Shadow of the Almighty. It's a book by Elizabeth Elliot, and it's written with the journals and the story of her husband, Jim Elliot, who was a missionary to South America and the Auca Indians. And one of the lines she pulled from his journal found its way into that book. By the way, I said this at the 8. If you're a young man in the room right now and you want to understand, even an old man, I suppose, how to live a life devoted and on fire for God, I could not recommend that book enough. Jim Elliot is an excellent example. But when he considered the cost of going to South America, leaving behind his wife and his newborn daughter, he said this: "No one ever sacrificed so much that he had nothing left to give." So let's talk about generosity. You may have heard me say before that it's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than it is to think your way into a new way of acting. That our feelings and our thoughts follow our actions. It's not the other way around. This is also true of gratitude. Learning to be grateful, your gratitude will not produce generosity in your life. Being grateful will not make you more generous. It's actually the other way around. Practicing generosity will make you more grateful for what you have. If you want to live a grateful life, live a generous life. So how do you live generously? Well, one of the earliest biblical examples is in Leviticus chapter 23. This is an agricultural example. God is talking to the Israelites and their farmers. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. So the Israelites were commanded to harvest a circle out of the middle of a square field and to leave the corners for the poor and for the foreigners to feed themselves with dignity, to harvest their own grain. Are you leaving the edges of your resources for others? Or am I consuming everything that I have available? Am I borrowing against future harvests to pay for the life that I'm living now? I can't be generous if there's never enough. Let me ask you this question. When you look around yourself, when you compare yourself to, say, your friends or the people in your peer group, are you more or less generous than your friends? Financially, with your time, with your money, are you more or less generous? How about this? With your parents and your grandparents, are you more or less generous than your parents or grandparents are? Let's really kind of poke the wound here. How about the people that you admire the most? How about the people that you want to be like one day? Are you more or less generous than they are? I bet you, I shouldn't bet, especially in a conversation about money, right? My guess would be that the people you and I admire most are living wildly generous lives. Because the best people always are. And I would bet you that if you could find a moment to sit down with those people, your mentors that you admire, if you could sit down with them and you could ask them this question: When did you start living generously? Tell me about what it was like when you started to live a life of generosity. If they don't say something like, you know what? At first we were kind of nervous, I'm not going to lie. But when we started giving, we found this immense sense of freedom, and it was almost like we had more than we did before. It's just been the most incredible blessing. If they don't say something like that, I will buy you lunch. I guarantee they will. Because that is how generosity works. And greed isn't the only reason we lack generosity. I'm from like the auto workers section of Michigan. That's where I grew up. My grandpa worked in a Buick factory. My stepdad worked in a battery plant for Ford growing up. And so where I'm from, we have a lot of people who work hard. They live a blue-collar life, and they're very proud of their work ethic. I sense some similarities with like kind of the South Dakotan way, as I've noticed. And I think one of the reasons it's hard for us to be generous is because we feel like we have earned what we have. We've worked hard for it. We deserve it. And this is true, but it's also not true. Let me show you this verse in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 6, when the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give you, a land with large flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant, then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. We need to remember that all that we have is a gift from God. And yes, you have worked hard for the things that you have, but there are plenty of people in the world who work as hard or harder for far less than you receive. You have been blessed to live the life that you live. And again, that is not your fault. But I do have a responsibility to do something about it. And it begins with remembering what God has done for me, right? We just said it. Sing it to the daughters. Sing it to the sons. Look at what the Lord has done for us. The number one most frequent command given in the Bible is do not fear, do not be afraid. But the second most frequent command is remember. Do not forget what God has done. That you might live a life of faithful generosity. So part 3, let's talk about faithfulness. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus has this to say about our possessions. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy, and thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If you walk out of here this morning and you go to a restaurant and you buy someone lunch, that would be a kind thing to do. But that would not be what we mean when we talk about living a generous life. There are broader implications here. It means developing a pattern, a habit in your life. You don't just do generous things, you are a generous being. It's constantly flowing through you. It's more than what you do, it's who you are. All right, I got just a few minutes for the most awkward part of this teaching. For most of this country's history, we, and especially Christians, have done an exceptional job of living generously and teaching our children to live generously. If you don't know this, I mean, outside of probably the last couple decades, every hospital that ever began in this country began by men and women, mostly women, who believed that the love of Christ was compelling them to go and show the world they loved them by caring for their sicknesses. Every university that began in this country, every school was started by men and women who loved God so much that they wanted to sacrifice and allow God to use what they had to teach the children of the next generation. Every rescue mission, Alcoholics Anonymous, nearly every rehab program, every food pantry, almost every arm of justice in this country is born out of men and women who generously gave their time and their money to heal the ills of the world. But Study after study shows that we're failing to teach that to the next generations. In fact, if you were born after 1981, don't raise your hands, but if you were born after 1981, you are by far, the least generous people that have lived in this country, by far. By every measure, by consistency of giving, by percentage of income, by total dollar amount, by every measure. Born after 1981. And it's a problem because we need the next generation to learn the powerful transformational lesson of generous living. We can't have them afraid of getting stomped on by an elephant. They need to know that this is actually a better way to live, not a worse way of live, but something is getting lost in translation. In fact, look at this. According to a Barna study, George Barna, his group, you're welcome to look into it, highly reputable. 80% of people born after 1981 would say generosity is very to extremely important to them. By far the highest percentage of any generation. Born after 1981, I think the next closest is like 56%. 80% of them say it's extremely important to them to very important. But 84% of people born after 1981 give less than $50 a year in donations. I suspect this is not a surprise to you, that you all know that it's easier to talk about doing something than it is to actually do it. 84% is by far the lowest. It's by 20-fold. It's 20-fold less than the next lowest generation in giving. We have a problem. We have not taught the next generation the benefits of generous living. Something has broken down along the way. So we can talk for hours about how we want to change the world, about how tragic it is that people live in poverty. We can talk about political candidates and what they might do to help those in need. We can read Karl Marx or Ibrahim Kendi. We can listen to podcasts about injustice. You can paint your entire body a Ukrainian flag. But it's all nonsense. Because if your desire doesn't lead to action, you're not helping the world. Unfortunately, we have to, in the most literal sense of the expression, put our money where our mouth is. Everyone wants to change the world, but no one wants to do the work. Jesus said it like this: the harvest is plentiful. I just can't find anyone to work the fields. The opportunity is there. And if you want people to listen to what you have to say, maybe we start with letting them look at how you live. What are you doing with what you've been giving? So let's close with this. Let me be clear. I'm not suggesting in any way that generosity is some sort of transaction. That if you live a generous life, you somehow like clear your conscience, or you're like sending lumber up to heaven to build another room on your mansion someday. That is not at all what I'm suggesting. I think those are distortions of the teachings of Jesus. But I do believe that generosity is a statement about what you believe of the world and your role in it. Do you believe that you are a partner in working to end the brokenness that causes broken families and single-parent households, parents who are addicted to drugs or alcohol? Do you believe that you have a role to play in ending the brokenness that leads to empty pantries and empty refrigerators, that leads to shut-off notices for water and electricity and gas, that leads to smelly clothes and dirty laundry? Do you believe that you have a role to play in meeting the needs of the world? Generosity makes a statement about that. And if you are around this church for very long, what you will learn about Fountain Springs is we believe we have a responsibility to work to those ends. And we work our butts off trying to make it happen. Not as a tactic of evangelism. We are not trading bags of groceries for confessional prayers. It's goodness without an agenda. Simply to show people the love of God. Goodness without an agenda. But here's the thing. We can't give without an agenda outside of these walls unless we give with an agenda inside of these walls. And that's what God is calling us to do. To trust him with our resources enough to say, here is our fish and here are our loaves. Take them and multiply them. Use them to bring your kingdom to earth. Let's pray. God, thank you for the positive opposite of greed, the invitation to live a life of generosity. For those of us who are still a little uncertain about it, Lord, I just pray that you would give us maybe a small goal to find a way to give just a little bit more away than we're giving now. To follow that Jim Elliott quote, what would it look like for us to just keep looking for ways to give a little bit more to others? Help us live lives of generosity. And may we witness the repair of your kingdom in the process. May you take what we have and use it to heal the lives of the people in our community and across the world. God, thank you for loving us. We pray this in your name. Amen.